The video you are about to see tells the story of the small town of Aulne, Kansas back in 1915, featuring the role of the Het and Unruh families as part of its history. Using Dale Unruh's HO scale model railroad layout, the actual model is on display at the Marion, Kansas Museum. It features the Aulne Mercantile purchased by Pete Unruh in 1920 and the Aulne grain elevator purchased by Lloyd and Ellen Darrow in 1950. The grass is green and the roads are muddy, but there appears to be much activity in town. We're looking west along the main business street of Aulne in 1915. Now panning over to see the grain elevator and the stockyards north of the grain elevator. Let's start with the Aulne Mercantile Company. This store was established in 1903 by Conrad Het. In 1914, it had 4 clerks and did $34,000 in business. That was big-time dollars in those days. It had several owners, and as I mentioned earlier, Pete Unruh purchased it in 1920. A concrete walkway stretches across the dirt street from the Mercantile to the hardware store. This must have been the original speed bump. Prior to buying the Aulne Mercantile, Pete Unruh had been head miller in 1912 at the Aulne Milling Company. This 4-story mill and its powerhouse were built in 1907 to produce ideal flour. The mill was conveniently located next to the grain elevator that in 1914 shipped 110 railroad cars of wheat to eastern U.S. markets. And as I mentioned earlier, this elevator was purchased by Lloyd and Ellen Darrow in 1950, who then added many additional grain bins and related facilities. And next we have the Aulne Depot. The original railroad through town was the Chicago, Kansas, and Nebraska Railroad. In 1890, it became the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad. It handled both passengers and freight. An interesting feature was the mail pickup. The trains that didn't stop were able to pick up a mail bag while flying through town. To the west of the mill was the scale house. Whoops, no pun intended. In the 1950s, this building was expanded to also serve as a small grocery store. Loads of wheat were weighed on these scales and then taken back to the elevator to be dumped. A special rail siding provided space for the rail cars waiting to be loaded with wheat or to handle livestock. Here we have the local stockyards. This was often the way nearby farmers such as John Het and his sons received and shipped cattle and sheep. John was the father of Iva and Ellen. Dale tells of the time he remembers his grandpa Het and his uncles Jim and John D. Het receiving hundreds of sheep here and driving them past the church to their farm a mile south of Aulne. And here's that church, the Aulne Methodist Church, that was built in 1896. It burned to the ground in November of 1915 and was replaced with a larger brick structure in 1917 that still stands today. And behind the church, we find the blacksmith shop. It must have been a busy place back in those horse and buggy days. And then next to the blacksmith shop, we see the telephone office. The telephone building at one time was just north of the Aulne Mercantile, but was moved to this spot just to the west of the Mercantile to make room for expansion of the Mercantile. Here in this telephone station is where the central operator was able to listen in on all the conversation. If you wanted to know what was going on in town, all you had to do was ask her. Then across the street we see the lumberyard. It was established in 1906. This was a branch of the Comley Lumber Company of Wichita, Kansas. Looks like it's open for business. Would you like to buy a ladder or a section of wood fence? Next door is the Aulne Meat Market and Cream Station. Looks like the butcher is getting ready to make some deliveries. I heard that once he backed into his meat grinder and got behind in his work. At the rear of the meat market and cream station, we find the barber shop, tucked in between the buildings. Then comes the bank building, which over the years was plagued with robberies and embezzlement. If you recall, this is the only business building that still stands today. Would anyone like to restore this historic building? It will soon be 100 years old. Looks like the bank has special security in place. Another store tucked in along the boardwalk was a shoe repair and harness shop. They must have had the same customers as the blacksmith. Next to that we find the local hardware store with a nice big covered porch. I'm sure they must be having a big sale. I see they're having a special on cream separators, the Delaval. Between the hardware and the tracks was another business of Pete Unruh's, a grain mill for feed. It had a two-story section up front with a big gas engine driving a shaker and feed mill grinder. It also had several sections in the one-story part for feed bags and other commodities with ready access to the railroad siding. An ice house was located out by the road. One of the foundation stones from this mill can still be found today by that railroad siding. Then across the track we find a schoolhouse. Its actual location was further east along the other side of the road, but it fit best here in this model railroad layout. This location is pretty close to the site of the new school that was built in 1917. Now let's visit the Pete and Mary Unruh home. It was near the north end of a town on a corner lot. Whoops! What's that 71 Camaro doing here in 1915? Let's move that to a more modern part of the railroad. Herman was born in this house in October of 1913, so he's probably inside taking a nap while his mommy, Mary, is out back welcoming company. Looks like someone is helping her with the laundry. The house had a porch alongside a summer kitchen with a walk to the water pump. No running water yet, so the bathroom was out back of the house. That must be why it was called an outhouse. Out back by the chicken house, behind the wagon barn. Dale has fond memories of this barn, but not in 1915, in 1950. He used to rummage through boxes of junk at that time that would be considered antiques today, like old crank-type telephones. And he, his brother Keith, and sister Donna especially liked to be carried around in an old wheelbarrow by their grandpa Unruh. The house had a front porch and a garden and gooseberry bushes along the south fence. Near the corner of the house were two lilac bushes. Dale, Don, and Keith liked to play under these. Again, in the 1950s, not in 1915. I wouldn't want to make them older than they already are. And they were always listening for that steam train coming down the tracks. What's that? Sounds like a train is coming. Run, kids, run. It's the number 2523. It's right on schedule. Now it's a week later, and the train stopped at Aulne. I see the passengers headed for Chicago are on board and ready to depart. Let's watch. comes another train, but it looks like we moved ahead a few years to the 1950s. It's a speeding streamliner, a Rock Island diesel electric. And now we've even moved further ahead to the year 2000. No passenger trains run now, but still quite a few freights run through Aulne, Kansas. It's a pretty long train. Looks like it's hauling some Caterpillar equipment. Quite a few products. No need to stop in Aulne anymore. It's been a nice visit, Aulne. Thanks for sharing your history with us back around your 1915 heyday. And it's good to know you're still on the map and that today you even have a website. Bye-bye.